She was 22 and homeless. No room, no car, no family willing to answer, just a canvas tool roll and $71.43 she had saved by skipping meals and washing dishes after closing. And with that money, she bought a dough bowl carver's studio abandoned above Bowl Hollow in Tillamook County, Oregon, where the place had fallen off county maps in 1989. The north sill had split beneath the wall. Rain entered through 3 holes in the roof. Tillamook County condemned it on October 14, 2021, with demolition planned for spring. But beneath the cedar disc, fitted into the hollow of the largest carving bowl, lay a sealed compartment untouched for 34 years, holding $23,839 and a journal written for whoever came next. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Mae Varden had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had left rooms before she understood they were temporary schools, before classmates learned her middle name, and supper tables where adults lowered their voices when rent was mentioned. Her father disappeared when she was 6. After that, every address came with boxes half-packed as though the family did not trust walls. Her mother, Elaine, could make a week's groceries from $12 and still cut each apple into even slices. She went silent when someone stronger entered the room. Stella learned early that silence could keep a roof overhead, though it could not make the roof feel safe. Only her grandfather refused to hurry her. Amos Varden lived outside Astoria in a cedar house that smelled of wood smoke and boiled coffee. Every Saturday he set a green log on the shaving horse and taught Stella to shape dough bowls with an adze, a bent gouge, and a crooked knife sharpened on a slate stone. He made her read the grain before touching steel to wood. Alder cut sweet and pale. Big leaf maple held a cleaner rim. Cedar was too soft for daily bread, but good for practice because every mistake showed. At noon, they ate cheese sandwiches while wood curls gathered around their boots. Then Amos returned the tools to their pegs in the same order, wiped each edge with camellia oil, and made Stella sweep the floor before she could take home the smallest offcut. Wood tells the truth at the first careless blow, he once said. She understood years later that he had not been speaking only about wood. Amos died in November 2017 after a short illness that left no time for a proper goodbye. By the time Stella arrived, cousins had emptied the workshop. The shaving horse went to an auction in Longview. His adze journal's bowl patterns and maker's stamp vanished into labeled boxes no one could later locate. Stella kept only the canvas tool roll he had given her at 16. It held 3 dull gouges and the smell of old oil. After community college, she rented a narrow room in Salem from her mother's older sister, Marlene Pike. Marlene wore soft-soled shoes and appeared in doorways without sound. She counted how long the shower ran, marked milk levels with pencil, and moved Stella's mail from the table to the top of the refrigerator as a reminder that nothing in the house belonged entirely to her. She never shouted. Gentle rules were harder to argue with. Elaine visited on Sundays and praised the clean kitchen while avoiding Stella's eyes. On September 3, 2022, Stella came home from the lunch shift at a retirement home and found her blue enamel mug on the porch rail. Her clothes filled 2 black trash bags tied with Marlene's square knots. The lock had already been changed. Marlene stood behind the screen door, one hand resting on the latch. "You have until dark. Do not come back." 8 words. Stella looked past her toward the hall. Elaine stood beside the coat closet holding a folded dish towel. She did not step forward. She did not ask where Stella would sleep. She only pressed the towel's edge flat with her thumb, while Marlene placed a grocery sack of canned soup beside the trash bags. Stella took the mug, the tool roll, and 1 bag. She left the soup. For 6 weeks, she moved north, in small, uneven stages. 2 nights passed in a Salem church parking lot beneath a cedar hedge. In Portland, she slept sitting upright at Union Station until a guard asked her to leave at 4:10 in the morning. She spent 3 nights under the east end of the steel bridge where freight trains shook rust dust from the girders. Her money fell from $71.43 to $48 after bus fare and laundromat soap, then to $29.80 after a fever and 2 bowls of rice soup in St. John's. In Longview, Washington, she slept behind a 24-hour grocery beneath flattened cardboard and woke with rain pooled in one shoe. By the time she returned south to Astoria, she had 12 bozings, 1 clean shirt, and a blister torn open across her heel. The Astoria Public Library was warm and asked nothing. Stella went there for the bathroom, the radiator, and the free newspapers stacked near the reference desk. On the 3rd afternoon, she found a county surplus notice folded inside the classifieds. The print was small, abandoned workshop structure bowl, Hollow Road, as is $5 quitclaim buyer, assumes all liens and hazards. Below it, someone had written in pencil, former Varden Bowl Works. She read the surname twice. At the desk, a librarian with silver hair printed the parcel map without charging the usual 20 cents. Stella traced the road west toward Tillamook County, then counted what remained in her pocket. $5 for the deed. $7.18 for whatever came after. She folded the notice into the canvas tool roll, wrapped her heel with paper towel and tape, and walked to the bus station before the library closed. By dusk, Stella was traveling toward a place that had remembered her name longer than her family had. The bus left Stella at a gravel pullout west of Tillamook before sunrise, its red taillights shrinking through rain, while the driver lowered her bag onto the wet shoulder. She had traveled 111 miles by bus and still had nearly 14 miles to walk. Bowl Hollow Road did not appear on the printed route map, so she followed Highway 6 for 3 miles, turned onto Wilson River Loop, and kept the parcel map inside her coat. By afternoon, the blister on her heel had opened again. She spent that night in a hay barn outside Glenwood, hidden behind a wall of square bales, while the temperature fell to 34 degrees. The hay smelled of dust and summer fields. Mice moved above her in the rafters. She slept with Amos's tool roll beneath her neck and woke before the farmer opened the gate. The next day brought a thinner rain and a view of the coastal hills dark with spruce. By 10 o'clock, she reached the town of Alderwick, a place built along 2 damp blocks beside a creek that widened toward the bay. She passed Wren's Hardware, Doris Bell's Harbor Cafe, a boarded Rexall pharmacy, Larkin Feed and Seed, and the Anchor Light Laundromat, where 3 shirts turned slowly behind clouded glass. No business seemed prosperous, but each one had swept its doorway. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of an old brick courthouse with a copper roof gone green at the edges. Stella wiped her boots on the mat and entered carrying the trash bag that held her clothes. The lobby smelled of wet wool paper and radiator heat. Behind a high oak counter sat a woman with narrow spectacles suspended from a silver chain. A white scar crossed the knuckle of her right index finger. The brass plate before her read, Emser's Evelyn Crowley, Deputy Clerk. Stella placed the folded notice on the counter. Mrs. Crowley looked at the paper, then at Stella's wet hair and swollen heel. "You are here about parcel 18B. Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure is condemned. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electrical service. Yes, ma'am. The well has not been tested since 1986. Yes, ma'am. And the county will not reimburse improvements if the title is challenged. Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Crowley removed her spectacles, cleaned them with a square of flannel, and studied Stella without unkindness. "Do you have $5? Stella unfolded the last bills in her pocket. A 5 2s and 18 cents in coins. The clerk accepted only the 5. She filled out a quitclaim deed on a manual typewriter whose keys struck with patient force. Then she turned the document around. Sign exactly as your identification reads. Stella wrote Stella Mae Varden. The clerk's hand stopped above the brass county stamp. Varden, she said. Stella waited. Mrs. Crowley looked toward the tall windows as rain traced the glass. Was Amos Varden your kin? My grandfather. The stamp remained raised. He used to come through here every October with bowls stacked in the back of a blue Ford. My mother bought one from him in 1976. Maple 20 inches across, with a rim thin enough to look delicate and thick enough to survive being dropped. Stella felt the canvas tool roll against her hip. He taught me. Mrs. Crowley lowered the stamp. Brass met paper with a deep, exact thud. The building was once called Varden Bowl Works, she said. Your great-granduncle leased it after the war. Amos apprenticed there before he moved north. I wondered why the county received no bids even at $5. Did my grandfather own it? No. Not on paper. Mrs. Crowley pressed a red seal beside the stamp. But some names remain attached to places after the records stop explaining why. She slid the deed into a brown envelope, then gave Stella directions in careful pieces. Take Alderwick Road north past the cemetery. Turn left at the abandoned Grange Hall. Walk 1 7/10 miles until the pavement ends. The second logging spur has no sign. Follow it downhill toward the creek. When you see 3 walnut trees growing in a straight line, you are there. The $5 bill went into the clerk's desk drawer rather than the cash box. Outside, the rain had weakened to mist. Stella crossed the courthouse lawn and began north. Alderwick Road narrowed between blackberry thickets and pasture fences. At the edge of town, an elderly man in a yellow rain cape was splitting kindling beneath a lean-to. His black dog, long-bodied and gray around the muzzle, came to the fence without barking. You looking for the old bowl shop? The man called. Stella nodded. That road washes deep near the bottom. Step on the alder roots. The dog followed her along the fence until the pasture ended, beyond the Grange Hall. The pavement became patched gravel, then mud pressed with elk tracks. The air changed as she descended, carrying salt from the distant bay and the mineral smell of running water. She found the 3 walnut trees just before evening. Their branches were bare, but their trunks stood in an exact row beside a sagging rail fence. The studio rested beyond them on a low stone foundation above the creek. It was built of weathered cedar boards 32 feet long and perhaps 18 wide, with a rear addition leaning slightly toward the hollow. Moss covered the north slope of the roof. The chimney was red brick, darkened almost black at the crown. Above the door hung a warped wooden sign. Only 4 carved letters remained legible beneath the lichen bowl. Stella climbed the porch. One board bent beneath her but did not break. The key Mrs. Crowley had included turned only after Stella lifted the door against its sagging hinges. The room exhaled cold air, mouse droppings, cedar dust, and the faint iron smell of rusted tools. Her fingers found the wall, all rough with old plaster. Somewhere inside, water struck metal at slow intervals. Light entered through a cracked front window. It showed a counter, 2 stools, and shelves furred gray with dust. Stella tasted plaster when she breathed. Beneath her boots, the floor gave a low complaint, but remained firm near the joists. She touched the counter and left 5 clean tracks with her fingertips. The back room was larger. A workbench ran under the windows, scarred by gouges and dark rings where green bowls had once rested. A shaving horse stood on its side beside a heap of roof debris. When Stella righted it, the wooden jaw still moved. She opened one drawer and found curled shavings protected from rain, dry enough to crack between her fingers. They released a pale scent of maple. The well pump behind the studio produced only a brown thread of water and a metallic groan. Stella filled a tin cup, let the sediment settle, and used it to wash her heel without drinking. From the creek, she heard stones turning under the current. A raven called once from the walnuts. Darkness arrived before she could inspect the roof. She swept one corner of the front room with a bundle of fair twigs, spread her coat over the bare floor, and placed the tool roll beside her. The cold rose through the boards into her ribs. Rain tapped the metal bucket beneath the leak, sometimes fast, sometimes with long spaces between drops. She ate half a dry biscuit saved from the bus station. Then she opened the deed and held it close to the candle stub Mrs. Crowley had tucked into the envelope. The paper named her as grantee. The language was plain, indifferent, and binding. For the first time in 6 weeks, there was a door between Stella and the night. It did not lock properly, so she wedged the shaving horse beneath the latch and lay down, listening to the creek move through Bowl Hollow. The house had been waiting for her. On the first morning, Stella carried the bucket to the well before the rain began again. The pump handle resisted until she poured creek water over the leather seal and worked it slowly. After 12 strokes, the pipe coughed rust-colored water, then a clearer stream with a faint mineral smell. She filled 2 jars, left them undisturbed on the sill, and watched the sediment settle. The outhouse stood 30 yards uphill beneath salal bushes, its roof sound, but its door hanging from one hinge. She repaired the hinge with a bent nail and learned to approach from the left, where the ground did not sink beneath her boots. For 3 days, she cleaned only enough space to live. She discovered that the floor creaked sharply beside the front counter, sighed near the stove, and remained silent along a narrow path to the back room. At night, she could identify each noise without rising. Walnut branches brushing the roof, the bucket receiving rain, mice inside the wall, and the heavier knock of the loose chimney damper. On the 4th morning, she walked into Alderwick, carrying the deed and $7 in coins. Wren's hardware was deeper than it appeared from the street. Drawers of screws lined one wall, stove of pipe hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled of kerosene rope and sharpened steel. Behind the counter stood Hollis Wren, a broad man with one eyebrow permanently singed, shorter than the other. He was repairing the handle of a garden fork with waxed cord. Stella placed her coins beside the register. "I need to make the chimney safe." Hollis looked at her coat, then at the old gouges in Amos's canvas roll. "You are the Varden girl." His granddaughter. He set down the fork. $7 will not buy what you need. I can work. I have work already." She waited. Hollis opened a ledger bound in cracked red cloth. "I can give you 30 days. No interest. You write every purchase yourself, and you pay something each Saturday, even if it is 50 cents. I cannot promise much. Promise accuracy." She nodded. He wrote Stella Varden at the top of a blank page and handed her a pencil. From beneath the counter, he added a grease-stained copy of Home Repairs for Rural Houses printed in 1958. "No charge for that," he said. "The chimney chapter is mostly honest." She bought a 6-inch wire flue brush for $4.25, 30 feet of rope for $1.80, a galvanized stovepipe elbow for $3.60, refractory cement for $2.15, and a pair of canvas gloves for 95 cents. Hollis added 2 used drop cloths without entering them in the ledger. Back at the studio, Stella read the chimney chapter twice beside the front window, then climbed onto the roof with the rope around her waist. The moss made the cedar shingles slick. She moved on hands and knees, keeping her weight above the rafters, and tied herself to the trunk of the nearest walnut tree before approaching the stack. The chimney cap had collapsed inward. She removed 3 loose bricks by hand and lowered them in a bucket rather than throwing them. Then he tied the wire brush between 2 lengths of rope, fed it into the flue, and worked it from the roof while a brick weighted the lower line inside the firebox. Each pull released black flakes. Some were dry as charcoal. Others came down in glazed curls of creosote that smelled sharp and tarry. She brushed until noon, climbed down, emptied the firebox, and began again. By the fourth pass, soot had coated her face except where rainwater ran from her temples. The brush caught twice at the smoke shelf. She freed it by turning the rope a quarter turn and easing upward, rather than pulling harder, exactly as Amos had taught her, with a stuck gouge. It took 6 hours. When the final pass produced only gray dust, Stella sealed a crack at the stove collar with refractory cement and replaced the broken elbow. She waited until the next afternoon before testing the draft. A twist of newspaper burned first. Smoke rose instead of spilling into the room. She added 3 dry maple shavings, then 2 pieces of alder split no thicker than her wrist. The stove ticked as it warmed. For the first time, heat entered the studio by intention. Stella sat on the floor with her hands around the tin cup and watched the flame take hold behind the iron door. She boiled well water for 10 minutes, added rice and half an onion, bought on credit from Doris Bell, and ate the first hot meal she had prepared since September. Afterward, she carried the lamp into the back room. Cleaning had revealed more than space. The workbench held a wooden vise polished smooth where hands had tightened it for years. 7 bowl patterns hung from nails, each cut from thin pine and marked with diameters in pencil. A coopered soaking tub stood beneath the north window, its iron bands red with rust, but its staves intact. Beside it lay a scorched adze block, a hand-cranked grindstone, 3 bent gouges, a maple mallet split along one face, and a foot-powered lathe missing its drive cord. On the wall, almost hidden beneath grime, a row of shallow cuts recorded dates from 1948 through 1987. Stella did not try to restore anything that evening. She wiped each object once and left it where she found it. The largest unfinished bowl sat upside down beneath the bench. It was nearly 30 inches across, carved from big leaf maple, and too heavy to have been abandoned casually. The outer surface had been roughed with an adze, but the rim was finished and dark from handling. When Stella rolled it upright, dust lifted from the hollow in a single gray sheet. She struck the side gently with her knuckle. The maple answered with a low, even note. She moved around the rim and struck again. Near the deepest part of the hollow, the sound changed. It became shorter, less resonant, as though a second surface lay beneath the first. Stella pressed both palms against the bowl and lifted. It weighed perhaps 40 pounds more than the thickness of the wood explained. She set it down and examined the inside by lamplight. The tool marks followed the grain except at the center, where a circle roughly 10 inches wide had been smoothed across it. She scraped the edge with a fingernail. A seam appeared. The center was not maple. It was a cedar disc stained to match the bowl hollow, fitted so closely that swelling had sealed it. Stella warmed the wood beside the stove for an hour, then worked around the seam with the narrowest gouge from Amos's roll. She did not pry. She pressed released and moved another inch. When the cedar finally shifted, it rose with a soft breath of dry air. Beneath it lay a cavity lined with oilcloth. Stella sat back on her heels. She lifted the first package with both hands. Inside was a short-handled adze whose blade had been wrapped in wool and coated with wax. The maker's stamp showed a small bowl crossed by 2 grain lines. Beneath it rested 4 carving gouges, a crooked knife, a burnisher of polished bone, and a slate-sharpening stone worn hollow at the center. Each tool had been oiled before burial. None showed active rust. The second package held billets of seasoned applewood, 2 blocks of maple burl, and a bundle of thin paper patterns tied with blue thread. The patterns carried names in faded pencil: bread bowl, salt bowl, rising, Truffchild spoon. At the bottom of the cavity sat a rectangular tin box secured with cotton cord. The knot had hardened. Stella cut it with the crooked knife and raised the lid. A folded letter lay on top. Beneath it were paper packets, cloth rolls, and a shallow tray filled with coins. She did not open the letter. Not yet. She carried the box to the front room, set it on the cleaned portion of the floor, and began with the packets. The first contained silver dollars wrapped in newspaper dated March 1988. The second held half dollars. The cloth rolls contained quarters and worn mercury dimes, their edges dark from years of handling. A smaller envelope held three $20 gold pieces in protective paper and a tarnished bronze star medal engraved on the reverse with the year 1945. Stella arranged everything in rows. She counted once by denomination, wrote each amount on the back page of the repair manual, and counted again. Then she separated the paper currency, much of it old but intact, into stacks of 25 bills. The process lasted nearly 3 hours. Rain began after dark and stopped before she finished. The total was $23.39. She checked the addition a third time. Nothing about the money looked stolen or hurriedly hidden. Each packet carried a date and a brief. In the same sloping hand roof reserve, winter sales maple order canceled for the next keeper. The words made the cash feel less like wealth than work stored in another form. The folded letter remained beside the metal. Stella placed the money back into the tin box, returned the tools to the oilcloth, and covered the open bowl cavity with a clean drop cloth. She was too tired to read whatever had been left for the person who found it. More than tired. Her hands needed stillness before they could hold those pages. She stepped through the rear door and walked downhill to the creek. The clouds had opened above the hollow. Moonlight rested on the moving water and turned the wet stones pale. Stella sat beneath the walnut trees with Amos's old tool roll across her knees. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the Pacific moved in darkness, too far away to hear, but close enough to shape the air. She watched the creek until the lamp burned low in the studio window. The house had been waiting for her. At first light, Stella carried the tin box to the workbench and opened the folded pages beneath the north window. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. Each capital leaned slightly forward, and every lowercase g closed with a narrow loop. Amos had written that way on birthday cards, tool labels, and the brown paper wrapped around her first carving knife. The hand was older here and less steady, but it belonged to the same family of motion. Stella placed both palms on the bench before she began. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the cedar cover held, the mice did not reach the paper, and someone patient enough to listen has entered this room. My name is Lillian Ruth Varden Cross. In May of 1988, Dr. Helen Morita at St. Vincent Hospital in Portland told me that the pain beneath my ribs was pancreatic cancer and that I should put my affairs in order. Doctors speak plainly when time has become expensive. I returned to Bowl Hollow and began putting mine where careful hands might find it. Our trade began with Silas Varden, born in 1849 near Bangor, Maine, who came west in 1874 and carved his first Oregon bread bowl in Coos Bay. His daughter Ruth Varden, born in 1878, opened this studio with her husband in 1901. Their son Thomas continued the work after 1922. And Thomas taught my brother Amos and me during the hungry years after 1933. 4 generations worked here not because bowls made us important, but because ordinary houses required honest objects. My husband, Daniel Cross, was killed near the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in December 1950. We had one son, Peter. He left Oregon as a young man and did not return. Work remained when people did not. Varden Bowl Works closed on October 3, 1988. The final order was a maple rising bowl for Doris Bell's mother. When I locked the door, this room had already begun its silence. If you are reading now, more than 30 years have passed without an adze striking the block. A few instructions may save you waste. Rough green maple while its moisture remains above 20%. Leave the walls 1 inch thick for every 12 inches of diameter. Dry a new bowl inside paper shavings for 14 days, changing them every 3rd day. For the final oil, warm flaxseed oil to about 140 degrees, never hotter, and apply 3 thin coats 24 hours apart. A sharp edge should cut without force. If you must force it, stop and sharpen. The money beneath this page came from bowls repairs, roof savings, and coins kept through lean winters. Use what the building requires. Do not spend it merely because it is there. An inheritance is not the object left behind. It is the unfinished work placed within reach of another pair of hands. Behind the back door, beneath the western walnut, you will find Daniel's stone marker. The bronze lantern in the tool bundle was his. Light it once for him and once for those whose names were not kept. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Lillian Ruth Varden Cross, October 3, 1988. Stella read the letter twice. The second reading was slower. She touched the date with one finger, then folded the pages along their original creases, matching each softened edge before returning them to the envelope. No tears fell onto the paper. She sat with her hands closed around it until the morning light reached the opposite wall. Then she opened the back door. The western walnut stood nearest the creek, its roots lifting the soil in long ridges. Stella cleared sword fern and wet leaves from the downhill side with a broken roof shingle. 6 inches beneath the moss, her fingers touched stone. The marker was small, no wider than a breadboard, and had sunk crookedly into the earth. Daniel Elijah Cross had been cut across the face, followed by 1927 to 1950, and a shallow cross, almost erased by weather. Stella washed the stone with water from the creek. Beneath the dates hidden under lichen were 4 words, "He kept his word." She remained kneeling until cold entered her jeans. Back inside, Stella unwrapped the bronze lantern from the lowest layer of oilcloth. It was a railway-style hand lantern, with a dent above the air vent and 1 pane of ruby glass. She cleaned the burner, trimmed the hardened wick, and filled the reservoir with a little kerosene borrowed from the can Hollis had left beside the stove supplies. The flame caught small and blue, then settled behind the red pane. Stella placed it on the workbench beside the folded letter. The light touched the gouges, the bowl patterns, and the maker's stamp without brightening the whole room. It seemed enough that one corner was no longer dark. She began to understand how a life could be held together by people who never knew they were carrying part of it. The silver-haired librarian had printed the parcel map and waved away 20 cents. Mrs. Crowley had added a candle to the deed envelope and given directions precise enough to prevent Stella from passing the logging spur. Hollis had trusted her with a ledger page when she owned nothing he could collect. Doris Bell had wrapped an onion and a heel of bread in waxed paper, then entered only the onion on the cafe account. None of them had called the acts generous. They had simply noticed what was needed and placed it within reach. Before this story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a warm room, or a few patient words. Tell us in the comments what they did. Small kindnesses deserve to be remembered by someone. That evening, Stella returned the money to the tin box and carried the heirloom tools into the front room. She laid the adze gouges, crooked knife bone burnisher, and slate stone beside her coat in an orderly row. The bronze lantern burned on the stove until the kerosene ran low. Stella slept with the folded letter beneath the tool roll and the old steel close enough to touch in the dark. Snow reached Bowl Hollow on December 2, 2022, laying 4.5 inches across the roof and bending the sword ferns until their tips touched earth. Stella watched water bead along the ceiling joists as the snow warmed above the stove. She read the roofing chapter in Hollis's repair manual 3 times, marking the pages with thin cedar shavings. The main roof measured 34 by 20 feet along the slope, including the overhang. Allowing for waste and the weaker north side, she calculated 23 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 14 pounds of hot-dipped nails. The materials cost more than she could pay at once. She used 6 old silver dollars from the tin box and entered their value in a separate notebook beneath the words, "Building Debt." Hollis did not ask why the coins were dated before the hardware store opened. When he delivered the shingles, he brought a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a worn leather grip. "My brother Owens," he said. He would object to rust. A man named Everett Shaw arrived behind the truck. He was 73, narrow through the shoulders and missing the end of his left little finger. He had roofed barns and houses along the coast for 41 years. Stella offered him wages. Everett looked at the studio, then at the snow melting through the damaged shingles. "You cannot afford me, and I am not charging." They began by sistering the split north rafter with a straight 12-foot length of Douglas fir clamped tightly before being fastened with staggered carriage bolts. Everett taught Stella to snap a chalk line above each course and to drive every shingle nail in 3 strokes, 1 to start, 1 to seat, 1 light tap to finish. On the 3rd day, he touched a nail head with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." "Set it again." Stella raised the hammer. "Pull it. Start with a clean hole." Wind delayed them twice, and rain forced them beneath tarps on the 6th day. Stella's knees bruised through her trousers. Cedar dust collected beneath her cuffs and smelled almost sweet when warmed near the stove. Everett spoke little, but every afternoon he inspected the courses from the road before leaving. 11 working days after they began, Stella fixed the final ridge shingle beneath a pale sky. It was December 16. That night, rain crossed Bowl Hollow for 6 hours without touching the bucket in the front room. In January, the chimney began shedding itself. Frost had entered the outer bricks through old cracks, breaking their faces into thin red scales. Mortar powdered beneath Stella's thumb, and 2 courses near the crown could be lifted without tools. She dismantled only what had failed, numbering each reusable brick in chalk before lowering it by rope. Hollis advised Portland cement. Everett shook his head. "Too hard for old brick." They mixed hydraulic lime with clean sand, at 1 part lime to 2.5 parts sand, adding only enough water for the mortar to cling beneath an inverted trowel. Around the flue tile, Stella used fire clay, mixed 1 to 3, with screened sand. She dampened every joint before packing it, then protected the work beneath burlap so the lime would cure slowly. The repair lasted 3 weeks. Daytime temperatures remained between 23 and 29 degrees, and Stella worked only when the mortar could be kept above freezing, beneath a canvas hood warmed by the stovepipe. She removed her gloves for pointing because she could not feel the joint through cloth. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb, and she climbed down to hold them around a cup of warm water until they hurt again. One morning, a repaired corner loosened after an overnight freeze. Stella scraped out 6 hours of work and began again without speaking. On January 28th, she built the test fire from newspaper cedar splints and 3 pieces of seasoned alder. Everett stood outside while Hollis watched the flue from below. The flames strengthened. No smoke entered the room. Above the roof, a clean gray column rose through still air and leaned toward the creek. Everett tipped his head once. "That will draw." The floor work began 2 days later. Beneath the grime, the front room was laid in white pine planks, some nearly 16 inches wide, fixed with hand-cut rosehead nails. Stella set every raised nail with a narrow punch before renting a random orbit sander from Hollis for $14 a day. He gave her 2 days for the price of 1 and told her not to thank him until the machine returned undamaged. She made 3 passes. 80 grit paper removed soot wax and the gray surface left by decades of damp. 120 softened the cutting marks. 220 closed the grain enough for oil without polishing it slick. Near the stove, she sanded by hand to preserve shallow adze scars in 1 replacement board. The work filled the building with a fine white haze. Stella wore a folded wet cloth over her mouth and emptied the dust bag outdoors after every 2 boards. At sunset, the floor looked pale and unfamiliar, almost unfinished. She applied 3 thin coats of warm flaxseed oil with cotton rags, allowing 24 hours between them, then left the room untouched for a 48-hour cure. The pine shifted from dull amber to dark honey, and the oldest boards deepened toward mahogany, where smoke and bare feet had compressed the grain. There was one morning when Stella did none of it. She woke with both wrists swollen and a heaviness behind her eyes that made the next task feel dishonest. Instead of opening the sander case, she walked to the marsh beyond the creek. A great blue heron stood in shallow water with one leg folded beneath its body. For nearly an hour, it did not strike call or move more than its head. Stella sat on a drift log until rain darkened her sleeves. When she returned, she cleaned the brushes and went to bed before sunset. The floor waited without complaint. February brought the windows. There were 8 altogether. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked from corner to corner, and 1 retained an original hand-blown pane dated in an old work ledger to 1788, reused from an earlier cabin. Its surface carried slow waves and a small trapped bubble near the lower edge. Stella removed that sash first, wrapped it in a quilt, and repaired it alone at the bench. She stripped brittle putty with a warmed knife, preserving the old glazing points where possible. For the replacement panes, Hollis cut glass 1/8 inch smaller than each rabbet. Stella rolled putty between her palms, pressed a thin bedding layer into the frame, set the pane gently, and drove new points every 8 inches. The outer putty was laid with a knife held low, forming a smooth bevel that shed water without showing above the interior sightline. 4 sash cords had rotted through. Stella used 1/4-inch braided cotton cord, passing it over the pulleys and tying a compact figure-8 knot through the iron counterweight. The first weight slipped from her hand and struck the bottom pocket hard enough to split 1 knuckle. After that, she tied every knot before lifting the sash. The final window faced west across the walnut trees. Stella seated the glass, cleaned the corners of the putty bevel, and raised the restored sash. It moved without binding. As she secured the stop bead, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch no farther than an arm's length beyond the pane. Its claws closed around the wet wood. It looked into the room, tilted its black-capped head, and remained while Stella drove the final brad. 2 winters later, on December 18, 2024, Stella carried a finished maple dough bowl from the back room and placed it beneath the west window. It measured 22 inches across, with walls left slightly heavier at the base and a rim narrow enough to hold without strain. She had rough carved it while the wood was green, sealed the end grain, and buried it in dry shavings for 14 days, changing them every 3rd morning. After the final cuts, she warmed flaxseed oil to 140 degrees and rubbed in 3 coats, waiting a full day between each. The grain curved around the hollow, like slow water around stone. She turned the bowl toward the light and found 1 shallow tool mark near the rim. She did not remove it. Amos had taught her that a finished object should show the hand without displaying the struggle. The studio had changed without becoming new. Lime-washed walls held the afternoon brightness. The white pine floors had darkened beneath regular use, and the old workbench carried fresh cuts beside those made generations earlier. 8 repaired windows kept out the rain while preserving the wavering 1788 pane. Above the stove, Daniel Cross's red lantern rested beside Lillian's folded letter. The brass key remained on the mantel until the first storm of that December. Wind brought down a dead limb from the western walnut, tearing away a slab of loose bark near the base. Stella went outside after daylight with a pruning saw and found a small iron plate set flush into the trunk, nearly hidden beneath moss. At its center was a keyhole shaped like the crossed-grain bowl mark stamped on the heirloom ads. The brass key turned once. A narrow copper box slid from a cavity within the tree. Its edges had been sealed with beeswax. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, its cotton dry but yellowed at the creases, and a note written by Ruth Varden in April 1918 while her son Thomas served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. Ruth wrote that the flag had hung in the studio window until the telegrams from Europe became too frequent to count. Thomas returned in 1919 with a damaged left hand and taught himself to carve from the opposite side of the bench. She had placed the flag in the walnut because trees did not ask soldiers to explain what they had seen. Her final line was practical: if Thomas comes home, give him work before questions. Stella folded the note along its old lines and placed it beside Lillian's letter. The flag remained in the copper box, wrapped in unbleached cotton and protected from the stove's heat. On May 30, 2025, she carried the Bronze Star Medal to Willamette National Cemetery in Portland. At Daniel Cross's memorial record, a volunteer helped her arrange for the medal's history to be entered with his service information. Stella stood among the small flags placed for Memorial Day, then returned the medal to its cloth wrap. It belonged to the studio where its silence had first been understood. Of the money hidden in the bowl hollow, Stella used 4 coins. 6 silver dollars had purchased roofing materials before she understood their value as family records, but only 4 heirloom coins were permanently spent, 1 for maple billets, 1 for window glass, 1 for hydraulic lime, and 1 for the stove repair that made winter work possible. She replaced their face value with ordinary currency earned from repairs and small carvings. The remaining cash went back beneath the cedar disc. She wrapped each packet in new archival paper, added a record of every expenditure, and placed Lillian's journal above the money. On the final page, she wrote only 3 words beneath the total for the next one. The shop reopened without a ceremony. Doris Bell pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for lost reading glasses and an advertisement for firewood, hand-carved bread bowls, and repairs. It read, followed by Stella's name and the studio road. The first order came from the librarian in Astoria. The second was for a cracked maple bowl that Mrs. Crowley's mother had bought in 1976. By spring, the mailing list held 43 names written in a school notebook. Stella accepted only as many orders as the wood and weather allowed. No customer received a promised date until the bowl had survived its first drying week. Some people waited months. Most understood. Caleb returned one April morning riding the same old Schwinn, though his knees now rose too high over the handlebars. A narrow wooden sign was tied across his back with clothesline. I had carved the words Varden Bowl Works in black walnut. Beneath them, in smaller letters, shaped with less confidence but greater care, he had added, "and daughters." Stella ran her thumb along the fresh cuts. "There have not been daughters here for years," she said. Caleb leaned the bicycle against the walnut tree. "There is one now." They mounted the sign above the front door, using the original iron brackets. Caleb refused payment, so Stella gave him a small applewood spoon, whose handle carried the crossed grain mark. He inspected the curve, tested the balance, and slipped it carefully into his coat. That evening, Stella opened a blank journal at the workbench. She sharpened a pencil with the crooked knife and began with the words Lillian had used 36 years earlier. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the roof and the window glass, about the 4 coins spent, and the reason each had been chosen. She recorded the moisture level of the first maple bowl, the exact width of its rim, and the mistake she had decided to leave untouched. She included Hollis's ledger, Everett's 3-stroke method, Doris's paper bags, and the morning a heron taught her that no work was sometimes the correct work. She did not describe herself as an owner. The word keeper was more exact. Near midnight, rain began on the cedar shingles. Stella carried the completed bowl to the front counter where someone entering in daylight would see it first. She extinguished the stove lamp, but Daniel's lantern remained lit behind its ruby pane. The house had been waiting for her. Outside the creek moved beneath the walnuts, and the new sign shifted once in the coastal wind. Stella closed the door without bracing it. The repaired latch caught cleanly. The dough bowl carver's studio waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Crowley had retired the previous autumn. Before leaving, she emptied every drawer except the narrow one beneath the brass stamp. There, inside a plain envelope marked Parcel 18B, remained the $5 bill Stella had placed on the counter 3 years earlier. Mrs. Crowley had written one sentence across the envelope: "Some payments should never be spent."
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.